That is all it takes? Two cities swallowed by fire so complete, so absolute, that for thousands of years scholars argued they never existed at all, that they were nothing more than a moral fable, a warning dressed in sand and smoke. Then the excavations began. Then the sulfur balls were found, still embedded in ancient limestone, chemically pure in a way that does not occur anywhere else on Earth. Then the layers of ash were dated, and the argument stopped, because what the ground revealed was not the remnant of a legend. It was the remnant of an execution. Stand at the edge of the Dead Sea on a clear morning and look south. The water is still. Nothing swims in it. Nothing grows along its banks. The salt content is so extreme that the human body floats without effort, as if the water itself refuses to let anything sink and disappear. Ancient writers called this place the Sea of Death, the Sea of the Plain, the Stinking Sea. They remembered, in the way that traumatized civilizations always remember, that something happened here that rewrote the geography of the world. The valley you are looking at was once green. It was once called the Garden of God. And then, in a single night, it became the most desolate stretch of land on the planet. The book of Genesis describes the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in fewer than 30 verses. 30 verses for an event so catastrophic that its memory echoed through every civilization that came after it. The Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, the Byzantines, the Arab historians of the medieval world. Every culture that encountered this story recognized it. Not because they had read Genesis, but because some of them had their own version of it, preserved in their own language, their own geography, their own terror. The fire that fell on the plain of Jordan was not a local event. It was a wound in the memory of the human race. But here is the question that no one asks loudly enough. If Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed simply because of sin, the kind of sin that exists in every city, in every era, in every corner of human history, then why has God never done it again? Why were these two cities, among all the corrupt civilizations that have risen and fallen across 5,000 years of recorded history, singled out for total annihilation by fire from the sky? The answer is buried in the Hebrew text, in the testimony of prophets who saw visions of what those cities had truly become, in the reports of two visitors who arrived at the gates of Sodom on the last night it would ever see, and in the terrifying possibility that what happened there was not a punishment for ordinary wickedness. It was a response to something far older, far stranger, and far more dangerous than that. Now consider the geography one more time, because the physical setting of these cities tells us something important. The Dead Sea Basin, where Sodom and Gomorrah most likely stood, sits at approximately 430 meters below sea level, the lowest point on the surface of the earth. It is the bottom of the world in a very literal sense. The surrounding region is geologically active, sitting on a major fault line known as the Dead Sea Transform, a rift that runs from the Red Sea through the Jordan Valley and continues northward. Beneath the surface, natural bitumen seeps through the rock, Genesis chapter 14, verse 10, mentions that the valley of Sodom was full of bitumen pits, slime pits, which caused problems for the fleeing kings during the coalition war. The ground itself was saturated with flammable material. The geology of the plain was, in other words, already primed, already loaded, sitting on a fault soaked in natural fuel at the bottom of a valley with no natural drainage, as if the landscape itself had been waiting for a match. And here is what you need to carry with you as we go deeper into this story. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is often taught as if it were a simple, clean moral equation. Sin enters, punishment follows, end of story. But nothing about this account is simple or clean. The cities were advanced. The region was fertile and strategic. The civilization was sophisticated enough to field armies and conduct international trade. The corruption that filled it was not the crude violence of desperate people. It was the refined, systemic, celebrated cruelty of a society that had optimized itself around its own gratification and decided that God's law was an obstacle to be removed. That is not a primitive failure. That is a civilizational choice. And it is a choice that raises a question far more disturbing than anything a Sunday school lesson ever prepared you to ask. If Sodom was this powerful, this organized, this entrenched, what exactly were the two angels walking into on the last night those cities would ever see? The answer begins with what the crowd outside Lot's door actually wanted. And it is nothing like what you have been told. For centuries, the destruction of Sodom has been collapsed into a single word, a single category of sin so specific, so narrow, that the entire weight of what happened to those cities has been reduced to one moral failure and nothing else. And in reducing it to that one thing, we have managed to miss almost everything. We have missed the prophets who described something far more complex. We have missed the Hebrew text that carries meanings most English translations quietly flatten. We have missed the testimony of ancient Jewish scholars who spent centuries wrestling with this passage and arrived at conclusions that never make it into popular preaching. And we have missed the most disturbing possibility of all, that what was happening in Sodom was not simply wicked in the ordinary human sense, but represented a transgression so specific, so targeted, and so dangerous to the divine order that ordinary punishment was never going to be sufficient. Let us start with the Hebrew, because the Hebrew text of Genesis chapter 19 is doing something that English translations consistently obscure. When the men of Sodom surround Lot's house and demand that he bring out the two visitors, the word they use is the Hebrew word yada. They say in verse 5, "Bring them out to us, that we may yada them." Most translations render yada as no in the biblical sense, a euphemism for sexual intercourse. And yes, yada can carry that meaning. But yada is one of the richest and most layered words in the entire Hebrew language. It appears over 900 times in the Old Testament. In the overwhelming majority of those occurrences, it means to know in the deepest possible sense, to perceive, to investigate, to examine with full attention, to understand the true of something. When Adam yada Eve and she conceived, yes, that is intimate knowledge. But when God says in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, "Before I formed you in the womb, I yada you," that is not sexual. That is total, penetrating, complete comprehension of a being's innermost identity. So, when the crowd outside Lot's door demanded to yada the visitors, what exactly were they after? here is the detail that changes everything. The two visitors who arrived at Sodom's gate were not ordinary travelers. Lot knew it immediately. The text of Genesis chapter 19 verse 1 says that Lot saw them and rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth. That is not how you greet strangers in a desert town. That is the posture of someone who recognizes that what stands before him is not human. Lot begged them urgently to come into his house rather than spend the night in the street. He understood that if the inhabitants of Sodom encountered these beings in the open, something catastrophic would happen. He was right. The moment the visitors arrived, the text says that all the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people from every quarter, surrounded the house, every single man in the entire city. This is not a mob of predators looking for vulnerable strangers. This is a coordinated, unanimous, citywide response to a specific presence. The crowd was not simply lustful. The crowd was responding to something they recognized, and what they wanted from these beings was not what you have been told. And here is where it becomes deeply unsettling. If the sin of Sodom involved a deliberate attempt to violate or contaminate beings of a different supernatural, if the yada that the crowd demanded was an attempt to do to divine messengers what the Watchers had done to human women, but in reverse, then the destruction of Sodom takes on an entirely different meaning. It was not simply punishment for a city full of immoral people. It was the sealing of a specific breach, a targeted response to a specific pattern of transgression that had already once before required a global catastrophe to contain. The fire that fell on Sodom was not disproportionate rage. It was a surgical intervention against something that, if allowed to continue, would have replicated the exact conditions that made the flood necessary. 2 cities, wiped from the earth so completely that their location was debated for millennia, not because they were unusually sinful by ordinary human standards, but because what they had become and what they were attempting to do on that final night crossed a line that God had already drawn once before in blood and water, and now he drew it again in fire. The question is, what does it mean that the same pattern is being described in the warnings given for the very end of time? That answer is coming. But first, we need to talk about the 2 visitors who walked into that city knowing exactly what was about to happen, and why the entire population recognized them on sight. Picture the scene carefully. The sun is setting over the plain of Jordan. The last light of the day is catching the walls of Sodom, a city that has never known a night it feared. 2 figures approach the gate of the city, and sitting at that gate, as if he had been waiting without knowing why, is Lot. The text of Genesis chapter 19 verse 1 says that when Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the ground. He did not wave them over casually. He did not nod in recognition. He prostrated himself the way a person prostrates before a king or before something that commands absolute reverence. And then he begged them urgently, insistently, to come to his house immediately rather than spend the night in the city square. Lot had lived in Sodom long enough to know what would happen if these beings were left in the open. He had seen what this city did to strangers, and he understood, in a way the text does not fully explain, that these were not men who could simply be robbed or beaten. These were something else entirely. The Hebrew word used for these visitors in Genesis chapter 19 is malachim, which is the standard Hebrew word for angels, but which literally means messengers, those who are sent. The same word is used throughout the Old Testament for both human envoys and divine beings, and the context always determines which is meant. Here, the context makes it unmistakable. Earlier in Genesis chapter 18, these same figures appeared to Abraham at the oaks of Mamre. One of them is explicitly identified as the Lord, the Hebrew Yahweh, and the other two are the Malachim who then proceed towards Sodom. Abraham conversed with them. Sarah laughed at what they said. They ate food that Sarah prepared. They had physical form, physical presence, physical substance, and yet Abraham's response to their arrival was identical to Lot's. Immediate, deep prostration, urgent hospitality, a recognition that whatever these beings were, they were operating in a category that transcended ordinary human visitors. The question of what kind of beings can eat bread, walk in the afternoon heat, and still be addressed as divine is one that the text never resolves. And that unresolved tension is precisely the point. Now think about what happened the moment these two figures entered Sodom. They had barely crossed the threshold of Lot's house when the text of Genesis chapter 19, verse 4, delivers one of the most chilling lines in all of Scripture. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. Read that again with full attention. All the people to the last man. This is not a rough neighborhood responding to rumors of wealthy travelers. This is every male inhabitant of an entire city mobilizing simultaneously across every district, every quarter, every age group, converging on a single location within hours of the visitor's arrival. How did they know? The text does not say. There is no mention of scouts, no mention of gossip passing through the streets. The response is immediate and total, as if the city had a collective nervous system that fired the moment these beings arrived. Something about the presence of the angels triggered a citywide alarm, and the of that alarm tells us something crucial about what Sodom had become. The Book of Enoch, which circulated widely among Jewish communities in the centuries before Christ and was considered authoritative by the authors of the New Testament, provides a framework that makes this response comprehensible. The watchers described in the Book of Enoch were divine beings who had descended to earth generations before the flood mixed with human women and taught humanity forbidden knowledge, the secrets of metalworking, of warfare, of sorcery, of the manipulation of living things. Their offspring, the Nephilim, became the mighty ones of the ancient world, the figures behind the legendary heroes and tyrants of pre-flood civilization. The flood destroyed them. But the Book of Enoch and the traditions surrounding it suggest that their influence did not die entirely, that the knowledge they transmitted, the spiritual corruption they introduced, persisted in pockets of humanity that carried it forward. What if Sodom was one of those pockets? What if the civilization that had built itself in that fertile valley had not arrived at its particular form of corruption independently, but had inherited it? A deliberate, cultivated, transgenerational tradition of defiance against the divine order, rooted in the same rebellion that had triggered the flood? That would explain why the men of Sodom recognized the angels on sight. They were not seeing strangers, they were seeing the enemy, Lot's response in the moments that follow is one of the most disturbing passages in the entire Bible, and it is almost always softened or explained away in modern readings. He goes out to the crowd and closes the door behind him, and he says in Genesis chapter 19, verses 7 and 8, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." And then he offers his 2 daughters who have not known a man to the crowd instead. This offer is so morally horrifying to modern readers that commentators spend enormous energy trying to contextualize it, to explain it as a product of ancient hospitality codes, to find some framework in which it becomes comprehensible. But notice what Lot's offer actually reveals. It reveals that Lot understood perfectly well that what the crowd wanted had nothing to do with ordinary sexual violence. If this had simply been a predatory mob, offering 2 young women would have satisfied them. The crowd rejected the offer instantly and with contempt. They said in verse 9, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came to sojourn, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." The crowd was not looking for human victims. They were looking specifically for the beings inside. Nothing human was an acceptable substitute. The angel's response is equally revealing. They reached out, pulled Lot back inside, and struck the men at the door with blindness, the Hebrew word being sanvarim, a term that appears only twice in the entire Old Testament, here and in 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 18, when the prophet Elisha calls down the same blindness on an army sent to capture him. This is not ordinary blindness. The men struck with sanvarim did not simply stop seeing. The text says they wearied themselves trying to find the door. They continued groping, disoriented, unable to orient themselves in space, as if their perceptual reality had been fundamentally disrupted rather than simply darkened. And even in that state, they did not scatter. They did not flee in panic. They kept trying to reach the door. Whatever was inside that house, they wanted it badly enough to crawl toward it blind. That is not lust. That is obsession at a level that had crossed into something spiritual, something driven, something that felt from the outside less like desire and more like compulsion. The city of Sodom, on its last night, was not simply a city of sinners. It was a city of something that had given itself over so completely to a specific form of rebellion that it could not stop, even when it was already being judged. And the 2 beings inside Lot's house had come not just to witness that fact, but to act on it. The fire was already decided. The angels were simply waiting for Lot's family to clear the blast radius. Now stop here and feel the weight of that number, 10. Abraham started at 50 and negotiated all the way down to 10, and God agreed at every step without resistance, without impatience, without revision. This was not a God looking for an excuse to destroy. This was a God actively seeking a reason to preserve. The willingness to spare an entire civilization of tens of thousands of people for the sake of 10 individuals is a statement about divine mercy that should be staggering. And yet the angels arrived in Sodom and found not 10. They found 1, Lot. And even his righteousness was described by the Apostle Peter in his second letter, chapter 2, verse 7, as that of a righteous man who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless. Distressed, not leading a resistance, not gathering a remnant, just distressed. The most righteous person in the city was a man who was grieved by what he saw and did nothing to change it. Sodom had not merely failed to produce 50 righteous people, it had failed to produce 10, It had failed to produce 5. It had been so thoroughly saturated by its own corruption that a single, genuinely righteous family, and even that family was compromised, as the events after the escape would reveal, was the entire harvest of goodness that 4 cities combined could offer. But the negotiation itself deserves more scrutiny than it usually receives, because the number 10 is not arbitrary. In ancient Jewish tradition, 10 is the number of a minyan, the minimum number of adult men required to constitute a valid congregation to hold a formal religious assembly to represent a community before God. Abraham was not simply asking God to do a mathematical calculation of good people versus bad. He was asking whether there was a community, however small, that still functioned as a legitimate witness to the divine order within those cities. A minyan of 10 would have meant that somewhere in Sodom, people were still gathering, still praying, still orienting their lives around the God of heaven. 10 would have meant that the flame had not gone entirely out, but there were not 10. There was not even the ghost of a community. The cities had passed the point of spiritual return so completely that even the mercy built into the structure of divine law had nothing to work with. The negotiation was not theater. It was a final audit, and the audit came back empty. There is another layer to Abraham's intercession that most readings overlook entirely. Genesis chapter 18, verse 17, records something remarkable. God deliberating internally out loud about whether to tell Abraham what he is about to do. The text says, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him?" This is God treating Abraham not merely as a servant, but as a partner in the divine project. The disclosure of Sodom's coming judgment was not accidental. It was intentional. God wanted Abraham to know. And by extension, God wanted Abraham to intercede. The negotiation was not an interruption of the divine plan. It was part of it. It established for the permanent record that the destruction of Sodom was not impulsive, not disproportionate, and not the result of a God who had not considered every possible alternative. Every alternative was considered. Every threshold was examined. The decision to destroy was reached only after every conceivable mercy had been exhausted. That matters enormously for understanding what happened next. Now, consider Lot's position within Sodom during all of this. When the angels arrived and Lot urged them so strongly to come to his house, the word the Hebrew uses for his urging is the word yiftzar. He pressed them greatly. He constrained them. He refused to take their refusal for an answer. This is a man who understood the danger his guests were in. But look at what Lot does in the morning. The angels told him in verse 14 to go and warn his sons-in-law, those who were married to his daughters, that the city was about to be destroyed. And Lot went, and his sons-in-law thought he was joking. The Hebrew word used for their response is wayehi kimtzachek. He seemed to them as one who laughs, as one who is mocking. These were men who had chosen to make their lives in Sodom. They had married into the city, invested in it, built futures there. And when Lot stood before them with the most urgent warning of his life, they heard comedy. They had been so completely formed by Sodom's culture, so shaped by a civilization that mocked divine judgment as absurd, that they could not receive a genuine warning even when it came from a family member in the middle of the night. They stayed, and they died with the city they had chosen. And then there is the detail that is almost always passed over in the rush to get to the fire. Lot lingered. Genesis chapter 19, verse 16 says that as morning came and the angels urged Lot to hurry, he lingered. The Hebrew word is wait mahmah. He delayed, he hesitated, he hung back. The man who had been inside the house all night, who had offered his own daughters to the crowd, who had received direct angelic warning that the city was hours from annihilation, lingered. The angels had to physically take hold of him, his wife, and his 2 daughters and drag them out of the city, because the mercy of God would not let them be swept away. That image of angels gripping the arms of a hesitating family and physically pulling them towards safety while a crowd of blinded men still groped at the door behind them is one of the most human moments in all of Scripture. Lot had lived in Sodom so long that even knowing it was about to be destroyed, some part of him could not let go. That is what extended immersion in a corrupt civilization does to a person. It does not only corrupt behavior, it reshapes what feels like home. And the question that image leaves hanging in the air is the one you need to sit with. If you were Lot and the angel's hand was on your arm, would you be the one who lingered? For most of modern history, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was treated by the academic world the way all inconvenient miracles are treated, as mythology dressed in geography, a moral fable that borrowed the names of real places to give itself weight. The cities, scholars argued, probably never existed. The fire from heaven was poetic language. The pillar of salt was metaphor. The entire account was the kind of story that ancient peoples told to explain why certain landscapes look the way they did, desolate, lifeless, scarred. And then the archaeologists started digging, and then the geologists started testing, and then a team of researchers published findings so specific, so chemically precise, so structurally consistent with the biblical description that the conversation about Sodom stopped being a debate about mythology and became something far more uncomfortable. A debate about what kind of event exactly could have produced the evidence that is still sitting in the ground at the southern end of the Dead Sea. The site, known as Tall el-Hammam, located in the Jordan Valley northeast of the Dead Sea, has been the subject of serious archaeological excavation since 2005. What the excavations revealed was a Bronze Age city of significant size and sophistication, one of the largest urban centers in the entire southern Levant during the Middle Bronze Age period. The city had massive defensive walls, a lower city and an upper city, evidence of extensive trade and administrative activity, and a population that at its peak would have numbered in the thousands. And then, abruptly, it stopped. The occupation layer that corresponds to the destruction event shows something that archaeologists describe with careful, clinical language that nonetheless carries an unmistakable weight. A destruction horizon so complete, so total, that no rebuilding occurred for centuries afterward. Not the gradual abandonment of a city in decline. Not the burned layer of a military conquest followed by a new occupying culture. A single, instantaneous termination of everything. The city did not fall. It was erased. What the excavation team found within that destruction layer is where the story becomes scientifically extraordinary. The pottery sherds recovered from the site show something that pottery does not normally show. The outer surfaces of the ceramic pieces had been vitrified, melted, turned to glass, Pottery vitrifies at temperatures above 1,460 degrees Celsius, which is hotter than the interior of a conventional kiln, hotter than the burning point of wood or organic material, hotter than any fire that could be produced by the technology available in the Middle Bronze Age. The mud brick architecture of the upper city had not simply burned, it had been converted into a melted, flowing, fused mass, as if the entire surface of the city had been subjected to a heat source so intense and so instantaneous that the materials did not have time to burn in sequence. They were simply transformed. Simultaneously, the researchers also found a trinitite-like material, a glassy substance that forms when sand is exposed to extreme temperatures, the same kind of material found at nuclear test sites and at meteorite impact craters. At Tal el-Hammam, it was found mixed into the destruction layer across the entire excavated area. And then there are the sulfur balls. In the region around the Dead Sea, particularly in the formations on the western shore near the area traditionally associated with Sodom, researchers have documented the presence of sulfur nodules, small spheres of nearly pure elemental sulfur embedded in a matrix of calcium sulfate and encased in a burned shell of calcium sulfate ash. These are not geological formations. Elemental sulfur in this form does not occur naturally in the geology of the region. The sulfur content of these nodules has been tested at up to 98% purity, a level that does not exist in natural sulfur deposits anywhere on Earth, where sulfur is always found mixed with other minerals and impurities. To produce elemental sulfur of this purity and embed it in burned calcium sulfate requires combustion temperatures estimated at between 2,000 and 4,000 degrees Celsius. The sulfur was burning as it fell, and it fell across a specific geographic area, leaving a distribution pattern consistent with a high-altitude dispersal event, something that originated above the surface and rained down across the landscape. The word the Bible uses for what fell on Sodom is gophet, brimstone, burning sulfur. The ground still holds the evidence. The scientific community has proposed several mechanisms that could account for the evidence at Tal el-Hammam and the surrounding region. The most discussed hypothesis involves a cosmic airburst event, the atmospheric explosion of a meteor or comet fragment at low altitude, similar in mechanism to the Tunguska event of 1908, when a cosmic object exploded over Siberia with an estimated energy release equal to approximately 2,000 Hiroshima-class nuclear devices, flattening 2,000 square kilometers of forest without leaving an impact crater. A Tunguska-scale event over a densely populated urban valley would produce exactly the kind of destruction signature found at Tal el-Hammam: instantaneous, omnidirectional, capable of vitrifying surfaces, generating temperatures far beyond any terrestrial fire source, and leaving no conventional impact crater, because the object never reached the ground. The airburst hypothesis accounts for the physical evidence, but it does not account for the sulfur. And it does not account for the fact that the destruction was geographically specific, that the cities of the plain were destroyed while the broader surrounding region was not. A random cosmic event does not produce a targeted destruction footprint. Something about this event was aimed. The Dead Sea itself holds evidence that is rarely discussed outside of geological literature. Core samples taken from the sediment layers of the Dead Sea show a distinct disruption layer corresponding to the late Middle Bronze Age, a period of abrupt environmental change so severe that it altered the chemistry of the lake, the vegetation of the surrounding region, and the human settlement patterns of the entire Jordan Valley for centuries. The disruption layer contains elevated concentrations of minerals consistent with a major combustion event, a spike in salt and sulfur compounds, and a dramatic reduction in pollen, meaning that the vegetation of the valley was essentially eliminated in a geological instant. The Jordan Valley, which Genesis chapter 13, verse 10 described as being like the garden of God, became a wasteland. The fertility that had made it the most desirable region in the ancient Near East disappeared so completely that it did not recover as a major population center for between 500 and 700 years. Whatever happened to Sodom and Gomorrah was not a localized fire that burned some buildings. It was an event of sufficient magnitude to alter the ecology of an entire region for half a millennium. And here is the question that the physical evidence forces into the open. The question that neither archaeology nor geology is equipped to answer on its own. The destruction at Tal el-Hammam occurred in a specific window of time. The sulfur balls are chemically anomalous. The vitrification temperatures exceed anything natural or human-produced in that era. The ecological disruption was regional and catastrophic. The abandonment was total and prolonged. Every physical indicator points to an event of extraordinary targeted, almost surgical destructive power. And yet, the biblical account does not describe a random natural disaster. It describes a... She has no name in the Bible. In all of Genesis, in all of the account of Sodom's destruction, this woman is identified only by her relationship to the man beside her, Lot's wife. That is all she is given. And yet, her fate occupies a single verse in Genesis chapter 19, verse 26, that has haunted readers for 3,000 years. But his wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. 7 words in the original Hebrew. 7 words that have generated centuries of commentary, debate, allegory, and confusion. Every child who grows up hearing this story receives the same simplified moral. Do not look back, or something terrible will happen to you. Obey and survive. Disobey and become a landmark. And then the child grows up, and the story stays exactly the same size it was in childhood, because no one ever goes back to ask the question that the text is actually demanding we ask. Why salt? Why specifically salt? And what does looking back actually mean in the world this story inhabits? Let us begin with the physical detail, because it matters more than it is usually allowed to matter. The region around the Dead Sea is one of the most salt-saturated landscapes on Earth. The shores of the Dead Sea are encrusted with salt formations, salt pillars, salt columns, natural structures produced by the extreme mineral content of the water and the intense evaporation of the desert climate. There is, along the southwestern shore of the Dead Sea, a mountain composed almost entirely of halite, pure rock salt, known today by the Arabic name Jebel Usdum, which is widely believed to preserve the ancient name of Sodom in corrupted form. Along the edges of this salt mountain, erosion constantly produces and destroys tall, pillar-shaped salt formations that local tradition has for centuries associated with the figure of Lot's wife. The physical geography of the region is literally populated with salt pillars. The story did not invent this landscape. The story grew out of it. or perhaps the landscape preserved the memory of the story in the only medium that could survive the destruction. Either way, the connection between a woman's judgment and the salt of the Dead Sea is not arbitrary. It is rooted in the specific character of a place that still looks, today, like a site of ancient catastrophe. But the deeper answer is in the Hebrew text, and it requires understanding what salt meant in the ancient world. Salt in biblical culture was not simply a flavoring or a preservative, though it was both of those things. Salt was the substance of covenant. When two parties made a permanent agreement in the ancient Near East, they sealed it with salt. Hence the expression, covenant of salt, which appears in Numbers chapter 18, verse 19, and in 2 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 5. Salt represented permanence, incorruptibility, the binding of a commitment across time. To be salted was to be fixed, to be preserved in salt, was to be held in a moment, unchanging, unable to move forward. And the opposite of salt in this symbolic world was corruption, the decay that happens when preservation fails, when things break down, when what was meant to endure dissolves instead. Now look at Lot's wife through that lens. She was a woman who had been given the most extraordinary gift available to a human being in her situation. She had been extracted from a condemned city by divine intervention, physically pulled out of the path of destruction by the hands of angels, given a specific and explicit instruction: do not look back, do not stop anywhere in the plain. And she turned around anyway. She was not preserved by salt. She was transformed into it. She was fixed, frozen in the moment of her disobedience, permanently oriented toward what she had been told to leave behind. The Book of Wisdom, a deuterocanonical text included in the Catholic and Orthodox biblical canons and written in the centuries before Christ, addresses Lot's wife directly in chapter 10, verse 7, describing her as a standing pillar of salt, a monument to an unbelieving soul. The word used in that tradition for her failure is not simply disobedience. It is unbelief. She did not look back because she forgot the instruction. She looked back because at the moment of crisis, she did not fully believe that what the angels had said was true. She did not fully believe that the city behind her was actually being destroyed, or she believed it intellectually and could not make her heart accept it emotionally. The city was her home. Her sons-in-law were still there. Her neighbors, her community, her entire life had been built in that place. And when the fire began to fall, some part of her could not accept that God was actually doing what He said He was doing. That hesitation, that last fatal look backward, was not a minor slip. It was a revelation of where her true allegiance was located. She had left Sodom with her feet. She had not left it with her heart. Ancient Jewish midrashic tradition adds a layer to this story that changes its emotional texture entirely. Several midrashic sources identify Lot's wife as a woman who was herself a native of Sodom. Not a foreigner who had come to the city with Lot, but a woman born and raised within its culture, shaped by its values, formed by its social world. In this tradition, her attachment to Sodom was not simply sentimental, it was identity. She was not just leaving a place, she was being asked to abandon everything that had constituted her sense of self, her community, her belonging. And one midrashic account goes further still, suggesting that her backward glance was not passive, but active, that she looked back not in grief, but in longing, that some part of her wished to return, that her heart had never fully accepted the verdict on the city she came from. If that reading is correct, then her transformation into a pillar of salt was not punishment for a moment of curiosity. It was the physical manifestation of a spiritual state that had been present all along, a soul already fixed in place, already oriented toward the condemned, already unable to move forward into the life that was being offered to her. There is one more detail embedded in the Hebrew text of Genesis chapter 19 that virtually no popular reading of this story preserves. The verse says that Lot's wife was behind him when she looked back. The Hebrew word is miacharev, from behind him, from his rear. Lot was ahead. He was moving forward, and she was behind, trailing, already separated from him by the direction of her attention before she was separated from him by her fate. The image is precise and devastating. A family escaping destruction together, and already in the geography of their flight, the fracture is visible. The man moving forward toward the life being offered, the woman falling behind, the gap between them widening, her face already beginning to turn. She did not become a pillar of salt in an instant of surprise. She became a pillar of salt at the end of a process that had been underway since before she left the house. And Jesus, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 17, verse 32, references her with a brevity that is itself a kind of thunder. He is speaking about the end of days, about the sudden arrival of divine judgment, about the danger of being caught between the old world and the new one. And in the middle of that warning, he says just 3 words: remember Lot's wife, not remember the angels, not remember the fire. Remember the woman who made it out of the city, and then looked back. The pillar of salt is still standing in one form or another along the shore of the Dead Sea. A nameless woman, frozen, facing the wrong direction. And the only thing Jesus thought worth saying about her in a warning about the end of all things was this: remember her, because the fire that is coming will not pause to let you finish looking. The technology of our present era has placed in human hands capabilities that would have been indistinguishable from the supernatural in any previous century. Today, laboratories around the world are engaged in the active editing of human DNA, the rewriting of the genetic instructions that define what a human being is at the most fundamental biological level. Chimeric research combines human genetic material with that of animals. Artificial intelligence systems are being developed that blur the boundary between human cognition and machine intelligence in ways that their own creators cannot fully predict or control. Transhumanist philosophy, which has moved from the margins of academic culture to the boardrooms of the most powerful technology companies on Earth, explicitly frames the human body as a problem to be solved, a limitation to be transcended, a design to be improved upon. The book of Enoch described the Watchers as beings who taught humanity forbidden knowledge, who corrupted the natural order by crossing boundaries that the Creator had established as permanent. The civilization of Sodom took that corruption and institutionalized it, celebrated it, and ultimately directed it against heaven itself. The question the biblical pattern forces us to ask is this: at what point does the rewriting of human cross the same threshold? There is a detail at the very end of the Sodom narrative that is almost always overlooked because it is overshadowed by everything that preceded it. After the destruction, After the escape, after Lot's wife became a pillar of salt, and Lot himself ended up in a cave in the hills with his 2 daughters. Genesis chapter 19 records what happened next. His daughters, convinced that the entire world had been destroyed and that there were no men left anywhere, made a plan to preserve their family line through their father. What followed was a moral catastrophe that produced 2 nations, Moab and Ammon, whose histories would intersect with Israel repeatedly across the following centuries, almost always in contexts of corruption and idolatry. The destruction of Sodom did not produce a clean ending. It produced survivors who were so damaged by the civilization they had escaped that they carried its consequences forward into generations that had never seen it. That is what extended exposure to a corrupted civilization does. It does not simply harm those who live in it. It shapes those who survive it in ways that outlast the destruction itself. Lot escaped the fire, but Sodom escaped with him in ways he never fully recognized. And so we arrive at the question that this entire story has been building toward, the question that the fire at Sodom, the negotiation of Abraham, the blindness of the crowd, the salt pillar on the shore of the Dead Sea, and the warning of Jesus all converge upon from different directions. Where are you in this story? Not historically, not theologically, personally. Are you Abraham, the one who intercedes, who argues for the righteous, who stands in the gap between divine judgment and human failure? Are you Lot, extracted by grace from a condemned environment, but lingering, hesitating, still grieving the world you were told to leave? Are you Lot's wife, physically present in the escape, but spiritually still inside the city, your heart already turning back toward the life that is about to be consumed? Or are you one of the sons-in-law, sitting in the condemned city on its last night, laughing at the man who came to warn you, certain that nothing so dramatic could actually be coming? Jesus said, "Remember Lot's wife." He did not say, pity her or analyze her or discuss her cultural context. He said, remember her, as in, make sure you are not her. Make sure that when the moment of escape comes, you are moving forward. Make sure that the grace being extended to you does not expire while you are still deciding whether to take it. The fire that fell on Sodom was real. The ground still holds its chemical signature. The salt pillar still stands along the shore. And the pattern that Jesus identified, the days of Lot repeated at the end of all things, is not a metaphor. It is a measurement. And the only question that matters now is not how close we are to the fire. It is which direction you are facing when it arrives.